Chapter 18. Justin waited until they disappeared from sight before sinking down into a chair. His head dropped into his hands, and his fingers raked through his hair, probably making it a mess, but he didn't care. He'd tried so hard to overcome the fear he had of hospitals, and tonight he had succeeded. He had overcome his fear and found the courage to support Ava. But as soon as he sank into the cushions, every ounce of courage vanished, drained out and replaced once again by foreboding and dread. His mind swirled back to 8 years ago, and the night when he'd held Carol's hand and waited until the beeping stopped. His back and butt ached from sitting in the hard plastic chair as long as he had, but he didn't dare move. The doctor said it could be any minute, and he would not let Carol die alone. He would not let her take her last breath without him by her side. A soft crinkle sound grabbed his attention, and he lifted his face. Carol's lips twitched, probably the closest thing to a smile she could muster at the moment. Her eyes, clear of the cloudy fog they'd held the last week, caught his. "Promise me," she'd wheezed, grabbing his hand and holding him tight in her gaze. "Promise me you won't give up on love." How could he promise that? How could she ask him? She knew that she was the only woman for him. He couldn't even think about loving anyone else, and he opened his mouth to tell her that. But what came out was, "I promise." He promised, though he couldn't imagine loving anyone the way he had loved Carol. He promised because she needed to hear it. She needed to know he'd be okay when she was gone, and he did it as his last gift to her. A tear snaked down his cheek as the pain from so long ago washed over him anew. What would she say if she saw him now? She would be livid, angry that he'd broken his promise to her, but even angrier that he had given up on love. Carol had been the epitome of an optimist. In fact, she and Ava would probably have been great friends had they known each other. "Justin? Is that you?" Justin turned to see the woman from the cottage. What had her name been? Mabel? Margaret? Margie? Yes, he thought it was Margie. "Margie, what are you doing here?" "I volunteer here when I can. I bring flowers to folks and read stories to the children. Mostly I listen. You look like you need a friendly ear and a good listen. Want to lay your troubles at my feet?" "I have no idea," he said with a sigh. Suddenly, everything I thought made sense in my life no longer makes sense. Margie sat down next to him. "I think we find that often in life. Are you here with a family member?" Justin chuckled sadly. "No, I'm here with Ava. Her father had a heart attack." "Ah, yes," Margie said with a nod. "Heart attacks are hard, but so is being in a hospital when you have strong memories of grief. Isn't it?" Justin looked up at the woman. Was she a mind reader? "How could you?" "I've been doing this a long time. I've come to recognize the signs. Tell me who you lost." Justin took a deep breath and blinked to keep the tears building up from spilling over. "My wife died of cancer in a hospital like this one, and I don't think I've ever really gotten over it." "I don't think one can actually get over the death of a loved one. What they can do is learn to live without them, especially if they have the knowledge they will see them again. Were you and your wife believers?" "She was, and I assumed I was, but I haven't spoken to God since the day she died." Margie nodded. "That's also understandable. God wants us to talk to Him and take our problems to Him, but He also understands our hurt and anger. And it doesn't matter how long it takes. He is always waiting for us with open arms." Justin could almost feel the loving arms wrapping around him and lifting the burden. A welcoming voice accompanied them and called him home. He knew what he had to do. "Do they have a chapel in this hospital?" Tears pushed against Ava's eyes as she stared at her father. The man who had always been her rock, strong and courageous, now looked so small in the hospital bed. An oxygen tube sat under his nose, and other wires ran out of his arms. An IV, a monitor of some sort. who knew what else? With the sheet covering most of him and only these pieces showing, he almost appeared half machine, like something out of a science fiction novel. His chest rose and fell, almost in time with the soft beeping that came from the heart monitor machine in the room. But Ava kept expecting it to stop suddenly at any moment. Her breath caught with every pause and only released again with the next movement of his chest. What would she do if her father died? How would her mother cope? Who would plan the funeral? Her mother sat next to her father, stroking his hand. Eyes closed, her mouth moved silently, and Ava realized she was praying. She should be praying too, but the only phrase in her mind was, "Please don't let him die." Had Justin felt this way? Suddenly, she understood how he might give up on love. She felt as if a large piece of her were missing already, and her father was still breathing. How different would it be if he never woke up? "Ava, you should probably go check on your boyfriend." Her mother's voice pulled her back to reality, but it took a moment for the words to register in Ava's mind. "What? Oh, yeah, I suppose. But he's not really my boyfriend, Mom." What was she doing? She wasn't supposed to mention the fake relationship to anyone, least of all her mother. But she just couldn't lie, not while her father lay in a hospital bed, and she was pretty sure Justin had broken it off anyway. "What do you mean?" her mother asked. Ava sighed. "I met Justin a few weeks ago. The story I told on the evening show was mostly true. We did both get booked into the same cottage, but while we were there, he found out his image had taken a hit because of his views on love." Her mother held up a hand to pause Ava's diatribe. "What do you mean, his views on love?" "Evidently, he's not a big fan, but he hosts a dating show, so he needs it to seem that he is." Her mother shook her head in confusion, but motioned Ava to continue. "His boss thought it would improve his image if he was seen in a relationship, but he wasn't in one, so he asked me." "He asked you to be in a relationship with him?" Her mother's words spilled out slow and haltingly. "No, he asked me to pretend to be in a relationship with him." Ava understood it was a lot to take in, but she thought her mother had been following the thread better than her face showed she was. "Why would you pretend to be in a relationship with someone? Why not just date for real?" Ava rolled her eyes. "I do date, Mom, but no one's been able to compare to what you and Dad have." She shrugged. "I want that perfect love." Her mother sucked in her breath and exhaled slowly, pinching her lips together. "Is that what you think? That we're perfect? Of course. You guys are still in love. You never fight. You have so much in common." Why was she having to explain this to her mother? "Because we work at it, Ava. We didn't start out that way. Your dad wasn't even a Christian when I started dating him." Ava blinked at her mother. "What? But then why would you tell me to only date believers?" "Because it's what God said to do, and because it's easier, Ava. I was headstrong, and I fell for your father and thought I could change him. Luckily for me, it worked out that way, but it often doesn't. Usually the believer ends up distancing themselves from God. Your father and I didn't want that for you or your brother or sister. That's why we stress the importance of dating a believer. And you're right, your father and I are still in love, but there were a few years where we almost split apart." "What?" It seemed to be the only coherent word Ava could manage. And suddenly she needed to sit down. Her entire world had just turned upside down, and her legs didn't feel strong enough to keep holding her up. She backed up to the other chair in the room and sank down. Her mother walked around the bed to her side. "Ava, your dad and I had the same issues that every couple has. We got married and then wondered if we'd made a mistake. Your father loves to talk to people, and I was more of a homebody. I used to get so angry when he would be late for dinner. He would get to talking to someone and forget to call, and I would be sitting at home watching the dinner grow cold alone. It always felt like he was choosing others over me. That frustrated me, and for a few years we fought constantly. How did you get through it? We learned how to live together. I learned that I couldn't change your father. He was going to talk to people no matter what I did. So I would tell him dinner would be ready half an hour before it really was. He made it home on time more often that way, and I also let it go if he was late. I ate dinner alone and packed up leftovers for him. A few nights of cold dinners alone, and he began making an effort to remember to call me if he got caught up. The point is, we figured out how to work together. It wasn't seamless. Ava shook her head. All this time she'd thought her parents were perfect. How many good relationships had she walked away from simply because they weren't perfect? Why did you never tell me? Her mother smiled and took her hand. I thought it was evident, Ava, but now I see we should have been clearer about our relationship. Fairy tale romances are just that, fairy tales. Relationships and marriage in particular take work. They are messy and complicated and impossible without God's help. Now, do you want to tell me why you aren't dating Justin for real? A soft snort escaped Ava's lips. I told you, Mom. It's a fake relationship. Besides, we are way too different, and I may have pushed him away. Oh, I doubt you've pushed him away. At least not for good. And I think something might have changed while you weren't looking. The man drove you all the way out here, and the expression on his face was not the look of a man who hated love, but of a man in love. No, he might have been yesterday, but then I had to go and meddle with things. Whatever you meddled with, you can ask for forgiveness. That's also a part of relationships. You will make mistakes. So will he. You just have to learn to ask for forgiveness when you do. Her mother was right. I should go find him. Yes, I think you should.